across the globe. And we would like the agencies around think tanks and universities and research centers that working around the clock on issues related to food systems to also have something to say on this topic. So we would like, as you have seen on the invitation letter, to have the opportunity to look at the food systems from an African perspective and focus and dig deeper into what we see and feel from our experience, work, and areas of expertise, what we feel are the policy-related options for sustainable food system transformation in Africa. We have a distinguished set of panelists here. And at some point, we'll also be joined as a guest of honor by Professor Joachim von Braun. I'll announce him when the time comes, who is the chair of the science group that is advising the team working on the Food Systems Summit. What I would like to do after thanking everybody for joining us is to go and give a round of introduction of those who are around the table who been working together with Academia 2063 to make this effort possible. The meeting today will be facilitated and moderated by my former colleague, Ms. Rajul Pandya-Lorsh of Kenya and former Chief of Staff at the International Food Policy Research Institute. Rajul, welcome. We are happy that you could join us. We have a coordinating group that's been working on everything to put together this event, constituted by think tanks, representatives, people working at think tanks and universities across the continent. It's my pleasure to introduce them here to you. I'll start with Dr. Asefa Admasi, Principal Research Fellow and Executive Director at the Ethiopian Economic Policy Research Institute. Professor Cheryl Hendricks, Department Head, Director of the Institute of Food, Nutrition, and Wellbeing at the University of Pretoria. Professor Ahmadou Alimbai, Professor of Economics at the University of Cheikh Anta Diop in Senegal. Dr. Milton Ayeko, Executive Director, Tegemawa Institute of Agricultural Policy and Development at Egerton University in Kenya. Dr. Fadi Abdelradi, Associate Professor, Department of Agricultural Economics, Faculty of Agriculture at Cairo University. Dr. Ed Brown, my former colleague at the World Bank, Senior Director, Research and Advisory Services at the African Center for Economic Transformation that's in Ghana. Professor Simba Sibanda, Nutrition Thematic Leader at Food, Agriculture, and Natural Resources Policy Analysis Network based in Pretoria in South Africa. Dr. Karim El Ainawi, Executive President at the Policy Center for the New South, that's in Morocco. We will be joined by distinguished speakers here, Dr. Debisi Araba, former Managing Director of the Africa Green Revolution Forum and member of the Malabo Montpellier Panel, and as well our own Dr. Katrin Glatso, Director of Policy Innovation at Academia 2063. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues who are gathered here, I will now at this stage hand over to our moderator and facilitator, Rajul Pandya-Lorsh, to lead us to the rest of the program. Rajul, the floor is yours, and thank you again for making yourself available to help us pull this together. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Badiane, for the kind introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to moderate the two roundtable sessions at today's consultation workshop on African policy priorities for the UN Food Systems Summit. It is an honor and a pleasure to contribute to this important and timely discourse. Colleagues, this is an opportunity. Now is the opportunity to rethink and rebuild African food systems to be more healthy, more sustainable, more resilient, and more inclusive. The first roundtable will focus on the drivers of food systems in Africa. This will help us to better understand the key forces, external and internal, that are influencing, shaping, and transforming food systems in Africa today and in the coming years. And that will allow us in the second roundtable to dive deeper into the opportunities to actively transform food systems in Africa to achieve these desirable outcomes I mentioned a few moments ago, to be more healthy, sustainable, resilient, and inclusive. And especially to focus in on what are the key policy options and the key policy priorities to achieve these outcomes. During the course of these two roundtables, we will get a picture of the key challenges, risks, and threats to the food systems in Africa. It is important we have a good understanding of these, but as I mentioned, the heart of the roundtables will really be to focus on the drivers, the opportunities, and the policy priorities for transforming food systems in Africa. The approach for the two roundtables is similar. During the first half of each roundtable, the panelists will offer introductory remarks and share their perspectives on a central question. We will then engage in a moderated conversation with the panelists. And in the second half of each roundtable, we will have a Q&A with you in the audience and hear your questions and your comments and perspectives. As our Ms. Tal has mentioned at the very beginning, we welcome your questions and comments at any time. Please put them in the chat box. We will come to them and we will address them as many of them as we can during both roundtables. So without further ado, I would like us to begin roundtable 1. The central question that each panelist has been asked to address in his or her introductory remarks is this question. What are the top 3 drivers for food systems transformation in Africa? We have 4 panelists, and I'd like to turn to each one of them. Our very first panelist is Dr. Asefa Admasi. Dr. Admasi is the Principal Research Fellow and Executive Director of the Ethiopian Economic Policy Research Institute. Dr. Admasi, I'd like to now call on you for your introductory remarks, and thereafter I will call on each panelist in turn. So over to you, Dr. Admasi. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rajul, and thank you very much, Osman, for inviting me to this panel. I would like to make one correction. I am not anymore with the Ethiopian Economics Association. I am an associate professor at Addis Ababa University Department of Economics now, just for the record. I think there are a number of drivers that really affect the food system transformation in Africa. I think one could mention many things, but let me just focus on 3 important drivers that I think are critical. One is the growing urbanization, in my opinion. Urbanization, of course, indeed, Africa is not an urbanized continent, but I think the rate of urbanization is growing fast in Africa. And today, I think more than 600 million people out of 1.2 billion people on the continent lives in urban areas. And this situation has created an opportunity for more people to work away from home and also eat away from home in many ways. This has therefore increased the demand for particularly processed foods. And unfortunately, there are growing signs that this situation has led to an increase in the prevalence of overweight people on the continent. So urbanization, in my opinion, is one driver. Related to this, I would say, I think to some extent, also in Africa, consumers' income has increased over the last 1 or 2 decades, as we know. economic growth in Africa has been quite formidable, at least before the onset of COVID-19. And this has created significant middle class. And this class had, the increased income has led to increased demand for particularly animal-based proteins in most cases. So increased income is one, in my opinion, one driver. The third driver, in my opinion, is information and awareness of diet and health-related issues. I think there is now a growing concern from many stakeholders, many participants, both at the international level or at local level, for food safety and diet and health-related issues. And this, in my opinion, has resulted in more societal attention to uptake, healthier diets. And this would obviously be magnified and intensified through, through interventions in the education system, in access to information, and so on and so forth. So information and awareness of diet and health-related issues, in my opinion, is another major driver of economic, food system transformation on the continent. If I have time, Rajul, I would like to add one more driver, in my opinion. I think, related to all this is also population growth. I think Africa is now the second most populous continent on the globe, next to Asia, and the rate of growth of the population is estimated to be about 2.7 up to 3%, and this population is going to increase or at least double by 2015. That is the estimation. And this growth is associated with increases in food demand and therefore can be considered as a key driver of the present food system as well as the future food system, in my opinion. And finally, I think ecological degradation and ecosystem conditions on the continent are also contributing to the food system transformation in many ways. And this has implication on general agricultural production and productivity. And I think these are some of the drivers that I think have long-term implication and on the food system in Africa, in my opinion. Thank you very much. Over to you, Rajul.
Thank you very much, Professor Admasi. You've laid out beautifully the key drivers from growing urbanization to growing consumer income to growing information and awareness of diet and health-related issues to population growth to environmental and ecological degradation. Thank you for that. I now would like to call upon our second panelist, and that is Professor Cheryl Hendricks. Professor Hendricks is Department Head and Director of the Institute for Food Nutrition and Wellbeing at the University of Pretoria. And I'm sure you'll agree with me, Professor Admasi has given you a great segue into nutrition and health issues. Over to you, Professor Hendricks.
Thank you so much, Rajul. If not, he's stolen my three ideas. So let me expand a little bit. The three that I had planned to cover was population growth, urbanization, and affordability. So we know that Africa's population is still one of the fastest growing in the world, expected to increase by 2.5 times what we currently are at by 2050. This population has quite different demographics to what we've seen in the past. In many African countries, the youth population is between 60 and 40% of the population. And so we know that the aspirations of younger people are quite different. As you age, nutrition changes and your nutritional needs change. And as we grow older, we're not able to enjoy food as much, and we have different nutritional needs to a young population. So we have this stark reality in Africa where undernutrition is still predominantly the nutrition area of concern, but increasingly we have rates rising of obesity, particularly in urban environments. So we know that population demand is going to lead to a lot more pressure on the food system, but not only just pressure for the foods that we're used to providing, but also foods that are more aspirational to the younger population. This will also be influenced and linked by the trend towards urbanization. So we know that as supply is constrained, prices of food will increase. And even though we've seen incomes increasing in Africa, there's still stark inequalities and a huge proportion of people who are not able to afford even the most simple plate of food. So we know also that in rural areas, land sizes are decreasing and as is soil productivity declining. So we have some major challenges to deal with as we face this shift in more currently producers becoming consumers, and a shift that we will see, particularly if we're not able to attract younger people to stay in agriculture. The urbanization issue is quite a challenge. Although processed food may be highly processed and also unhealthy, many of those processing techniques are age old. So adding salt, drying, many different ways of preserving food. And this is an essential component in urbanization. So as people urbanize, the scramble for fuel becomes a problem. If people are working long hours or traveling long hours to get to work and home again, the need for more convenience foods becomes necessary, especially as women's time gets constrained as they work more and are engaged more in paid labor. So there are constraints on fuel, there's constraints on time, there's increasing demand for convenience. And actually food processing, such as canning, can actually reduce the cost of food for many urban populations because you don't have to process it or cook it for that long. So there are benefits to providing processed food. We need to look, of course, at the content of that food and what the ingredients are. So if you're just looking at, for example, canned beans that have no sugar added, there's nothing unhealthy about that. In fact, it might save 3 to 4 hours of cooking time in a household. So the positives and negatives, but urbanization will definitely change the kind of food that is demanded in Africa in future. But the recent SOFI report raises the issue of affordability quite considerably, pointing out that close to 1 million of the 3 billion people who cannot afford a healthy diet live in Africa. And so as the population pressure increases and perhaps urban poverty increases, this becomes a bigger issue. So in Africa, only 12% of the population are able to achieve a calorie sufficient diet, 56% a nutrient adequate diet, and 80% of people in Africa are not able to access a healthy diet. So these are components that will drive the system in future. If we aren't able to significantly reduce poverty, we're going to see more undernutrition. And we also see in many countries like Kenya, South Africa, where urbanization rates are high, the coexistence of undernutrition as well as obesity. And this is driven by cheap food being available, so cheap calories essentially driving the demand for food. So in future, we're going to have to think more creatively, I think, in terms of how we meet this demand that will shift with growing populations and with urbanization. I think I'll end it for now. Rajul?
Great. Thank you so much, Cheryl. Very key points you brought in here, especially the issue of affordability, and that builds greatly on the points that you and Professor Admasi have made on growing demand, but then the question of affordability coming in. And of course, you raise also the issue of the other demands on energy and so forth, as well as, of course, population and urbanization. Thank you so much. Let me now turn to our third panelist, and that is Professor Amadou Alimbaye, Professor of Economics at the University Sheikh Anta Diop. Over to you, Professor Professor Mbaye, are you muted? Let me hear Professor Mbaye. If not, I will come to the fourth panelist and take Professor Mbaye thereafter. Okay, let me move to our fourth panelist, and that is Dr. Milton Ayeko, who is Executive Director of the Tegemeo Institute of Agricultural Policy and Development at Egerton University. Professor Ayeko, we look forward to your remarks on the key drivers of food systems transformation in Africa. Over to you, Dr. Ayeko. I'm not sure we have Dr. Ayeko online either. I will take a moment or so, give him a chance. If not, I will come back to Professor Admasi and Dr. Admasi and Professor Hendricks and have a conversation with them. Okay, we may have lost both of our two panelists, Professor Mbaye and Dr. Ayeko, to internet connectivity issues. So may I come back then to Professor Admasi and to Asefa and to Cheryl and have a brief conversation with them, and then we will reconnect our other two panelists. So both of you have raised the issue of population growth, population movement from rural to urban areas, from youth to aging, and the demographics, essentially the demographic transition. Let me probe a little bit further on that and explore further the implications for food systems in Africa. One big question that you have raised is essentially the demand, the changing demand for food, the changing demand towards more processed foods, towards more convenience foods, and the like. What do you imagine or what do you expect will be implications for the agricultural sector in Africa? How will that need to adjust? Do you see more local capacities to provide that food? Do you see changes in trade patterns? Do you see changes in the small business and medium business, even large business sector in terms of catering? What do you think it will mean for the agricultural and non-agricultural sectors to react to this changing consumer demand driven by population growth and urbanization? Let me come first to Asefa and then to Cheryl. Asefa, any implications of what these drivers may actually portend for the larger food system?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, Rajul. I think this will have serious implication on the agricultural production system itself in many ways. And we know that agricultural production system, as it stands now in Africa, is characterized by low productivity, low input, and the growing demand for food would in general mean that agriculture has to respond to this growing demand. But in addition to that, I think, as you said, whether we like it or not, Africa is urbanizing, and that creates an opportunity for small businesses to really integrate themselves with market, and as more small businesses are coming closer to, or they have proximity to urban centers, the potential for engaging in the processing of food would be increased, and therefore it would create a business environment. But of course, as was said earlier by my colleague from South Africa, this has its own positive and negative implications. So everything is not always positive, but then there are negative implications as well. So agriculture would have to respond to this. The market would have to respond, and obviously there is a growing trend of supermarket influence, at least in some parts of Africa, and so all these things are really very critical in the entire system, the distribution as well as in the production system of agriculture production. That's what I have from my side. Thank you, Raj.
Thank you, Asefa. Let me come over to Cheryl then.
Thanks, Rajul. I think it depends really on how we manage the process from here and how we manage this demand and the supply response. So the incentives that African governments provide for producers will be crucial in terms of meeting this demand. So we can do nothing, of course, and allow import gaps to rise. So we become more dependent on the rest of the world to fill that import gap. We already see that in West Africa, for example. Many countries are importing 40 to 60% of the rice and staples that are consumed in West Africa. There was a little bit of a push after the 2007-2008 food price crisis to try and change this and to stimulate production. But unless we look at the entire value chain and make sure that there are aggregation plants, there are processing opportunities, we're going to see the same flop happen as what happened with the incentives to improve production in 2007-2008. So it really does depend as well on the general infrastructure development and how well linked communities are to urban centres and where the demand is. So communities that are very isolated will not be able to find those linkages, but urbanization will bring the development of more roads, will provide more linkages of more remote communities to those urban opportunities. So it could go either way, but we need to really think about the incentives we put out there for both consumption and for production. So we need to have mindful consumers to think about how our demand is driving the local production linkages. But of course we could, with increasing increasing demand, we could be overstretching our resources even more. So small land sizes, poor soils, low input agriculture could put a bigger strain on the rural resources. So yeah, it could increase the risks, but it could also bring more people into the food system. So it really depends on how the patterns shape in future as to what the future food system will look like.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. I would like to come back to Professor Assefa in a moment, but before I do that, I'd like to remind all the participants, we welcome your questions and comments at any time. Please do use the chat box to give us those comments and questions, and we'll come to them very shortly. And I will also give a heads up that I will come to one of the Mmo panel members in a moment to also ask for his input, and that will be Professor Noble Banada. I will come to him in just about a few more minutes. But I'd like to come back to Assefa. Assefa, Cheryl raised the very important issue of the stretching of our resources, the strain we will put on our resources to address these changing demands. And you had raised in your remarks the concern about environmental and ecological strains. So I'd like to ask you to comment on that in terms of what do you see as some of the major environmental issues coming in the coming years that will impact on the food system's capacity in Africa to deliver the changing products that consumers will be demanding. What do you see as the big environmental drivers, big environmental issues that we need to be aware of? Over to you, Assefa.
Yeah, thank you, Rajul. I think, I mean, as was said earlier, the environmental stress is going to be challenging because increased population means increased production of food, and that would mean increased deforestation, for instance, increased soil degradation, increased using of ecological resources, biodiversity loss, and so on and so forth. So many ecological implications are expected, unless we have policies that really tries to at least minimize the impact on the ecology. I mean, the expanded production on agriculture always, have implication on the ecology, on the environment, and so the environmental challenges are huge. But I think with appropriate policies, with appropriate incentives, and other mechanisms, appropriate policies, we can, or governments, African governments can minimize some of the ecological disasters that would be implicated. I mean, together with this, we should never forget the impact of climate change. I mean, climate change is real. It is coming, and its effect is visible in many parts of Africa, and that will aggravate the ecological challenge to some extent. And therefore, more effort, more research, more interventions, more incentives would have to be provided in order to avert some of the ecological disasters that might follow because of increased production. Technology can be considered here. Technological innovations could really help in really maximizing or at least improving the efficiency of production systems, as well as distribution and what have you. And so scientific and technological innovations could be really help as well in this regard. That's what I could think right now, Raju. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you raised a very important point of technological innovations and of climate change, which is now coming into this discourse. I'd like to come back to Cheryl for one more comment, and then I'll open up, I'll go to the Mmo panel and to the audience. Cheryl, you're a member of the scientific group. So I'm also very curious to hear from you, following this technology, innovation, science, and you come in from academia. Any insights from your side in terms of how we need to transform the way in which we approach science, the way in which we approach education in Africa that would contribute to addressing some of these key drivers? Any insights on your side? Over to you, Cheryl.
You ask a very important question. Of course, education comes in right from the start. So we need to be including education on sustainable consumption and production throughout the schooling system, because that's where people's values are shaped. And also partly where their diets information comes from. And so we make responsible consumers by engaging with children early and helping them to understand the reasons why we have to change, or why we have to think carefully about what we put on our plates and in our mouths. So yeah, for sure. But I think there are many roles for science to play, and there are many solutions on the table that the science group, as well as the action tracks, are putting forward to solving these problems, but they're very context specific. And so there's a very particular role for academics and for thinking people in Africa to contextualize and think about what will really work in our own environment, what are the critical challenges, and what can we bring to the table, not only in terms of high-flying science, blue sky kind of science, but also a lot of the indigenous knowledge that is embedded in our societies. A lot of that has actually got scientific backing, and they're very clever reasons why many of those indigenous technologies have withstood the test of time. So we probably need to be listening and talking more closely as a community in Africa to be able to understand the different perspectives from different groups of people. Thanks, Rajul.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. I'm so glad you also raised the issue of indigenous technology, indigenous knowledge, and how we can tap into that better in Africa. And that will also allow us to unleash more technologies and so forth. So I would like at this moment, before I come to our audience, I would like to call on some of the Mmo panel members whom we are very fortunate to have with us today. And the first person I would like to call on is Professor Noble Banada from the University of Makerere, who's also on Mmo panel. Professor Banada, we welcome your insights. Over to you for a brief comment.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Greetings from rainy Kampala. It's raining down here, and we are as happy as you can imagine when we see water, because we think water, energy, and nutrients will shape the future Africa. Much as you didn't ask me a specific question, I would think that if we just to sum it up, what my colleagues have talked about, I think Africa we need to start thinking about resource recovery and creating circularity in our agricultural systems so that we can sustain the growing populations as others have talked about. But also interestingly, I think also we need to find a niche where we make, in the words of the president of the African Development Bank, to make agriculture sexy for the youth. And I think one of the ways we need to do is to have technology in agriculture. As a Mmo panelist, we've authored a report on digital agriculture. But as I talk now, I see how exciting it is to me and some of the other technologies we have here in Uganda, in Kenya and Tanzania, where we're using Internet of Things and on farms, and how it is changing farming in this part of the world, and how the youth are also excited to be part of this, this revolution, if I may say. And that also has to tarry with other efforts in skills development. We normally talk about jobs, and Osman normally corrects me when I talk about jobs and reminds me that skills development, especially technical skills. I was fortunate enough to study my master's and PhD in a European city, and I saw how skills development at technical level could really revolutionize a country. I think we need also to pay attention to our technical schools, not only universities. Universities are good. I'm a professor at the university. It's nice, but I think to move a country, we need the guys who will roll up their sleeves and really do the actual work. If I'm a farmer X in a village Y, and I want to have my crops probably irrigated, I'm more interested to work with a technician who will lay the pipes than a professor from a certain university. So I think we need to think about that, but also as we go forward as universities, as I come to the end, universities, we need also to think about investing in technologies, processes, environmental technologies and processes for nutrient recovery from residues, especially from animals. In many of the countries, we have a lot of also waste where we can recycle nutrients, because each time we harvest, we are also mining nutrients. I thank you for the opportunity you've given me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Banada, for sharing with us your key points from resource recovery, which I think was very important to making agriculture sexy for the youth and so on. Let me come back, and I would like to call on William Brent. William is the Chief Campaign Officer at Power for All. William, you've heard several of our panelists talk about technology and innovation. And Cheryl had also mentioned the changing demand on energy. So I'd be very interested to hear your perspective on some of the key drivers for food systems in Africa, focusing on technology and innovation. Over to you, William. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rahul. It's a pleasure to be here. I feel a little bit out of place because I'm generally working in the energy sector. But the work that we're doing in Africa and Asia has led me deep into the food community, which I'm very thankful for, because it's opened my eyes to a lot of issues that I hadn't really been thinking about. And our organization, Power for All, specifically is focused on trying to see what the role for decentralized renewable energy solutions, off-grid solutions like mini grids and rooftop solar, can play in helping to industrialize different parts of the food value chain. So it's been great to see the work that Mmo Panel has done in recent years on solar irrigation, but from our perspective, solar irrigation can only be the start of the solution in terms of increasing productivity and income for smallholder farmers. Simply because if you just use irrigation to increase yield, you're still not extracting the additional value from that yield through processing and cold storage. And so we're trying to see where we can create end-to-end solutions for providing resilient, clean energy solutions along the food and agricultural value chain. So I think it's going to require a very heavy level of collaboration between the energy sectors and the agriculture and food sectors. And so I welcome any and all thoughts and input as we proceed in our work. And just to let everybody know that I'll share in the chat an event that we're hosting as part of the Food Systems Summit, specifically on this issue on April 20th. So if you'd like to get involved, my email is on the link that I'll share. And I, again, very grateful for being able to be here today, and thanks for letting me make an intervention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, William. Thank you for making that intervention. I would like to take a question from the audience, and I'd like to direct that to Cheryl. Cheryl, this question is coming in from Justice Njokoto with the Central University in Ghana. And Justice is asking, as nutritional needs differ between young and old, would the implications of the drivers of African food systems also differ depending on base or age? You'd started to talk about that. Can you elaborate a bit more on that, Cheryl? Over to you.
Sure, it's an interesting question. Absolutely. So as we cycle through life, we start off having to have a fairly easily digested diet and fairly bland diet. And as you go through life and you enter into the last stage of life as an older person, you return to much the same needs as those early start out for nutrition. But we have to think very carefully at each different stages of the life cycle. So children have very small stomachs, for example. They need to eat 5 to 6 times a day in order to get the amount of food in that's required. So a 20-month-old baby boy has the same requirements as an adult man, essentially, for filling that calorie and some of the nutrient gaps. But we don't often think of that. We often think of children's portions as being much smaller, but over the day, they need to be eating enough. And we need to be thinking about how we can pack enough nutrients, or what we call nutrient-dense foods, into those little stomachs. And so as we look for foods in the food system to provide solutions, we have to look, for example, at foods that you can eat the root, the stems, and the leaves, for example, or the fruit and also the leaves. And many of those highly nutritious foods are, of course, also highly perishable. So the discussion around cold storage is very important. Of course, in pregnancy, women have exceptionally high nutritional needs in some of the nutrients. And we know that the first 1,000 days is critical to ensure healthy, productive adults later in life. So yes, they do differ through the life cycle, and we need to be thinking about the range of those different requirements as we enter into these discussions on food systems, and making it easy and also safe. So in many children's diseases, it's not necessarily the food that is that causes illness, but poor water quality used in preparation of food, in diluting foods, and also just washing dishes, for example, or washing hands. So COVID has made us a little bit more aware of those requirements, not just for COVID, but for general food safety. So yes, there's a very important point. Rajul, can I pick up quickly on the indigenous diets?
Yes, please do so.
Well?
Yeah.
One of the things we have to watch out very carefully for as food systems develop in Africa is that we lose the treasure of our indigenous food systems. And so we need to bear this in mind as well as we think about what we will use to shape the future of food systems, that we're able to retain the wisdom of many of those combinations of foods that do rest in indigenous diets. Many of them are very smart combinations of proteins, for example, to fill protein deficiencies. And as we develop the food system, we need to think of how we can preserve that. So how can we make those traditional foods available in a pre-cooked phase so that it doesn't take as much time to prepare, but where we preserve the nutritional value of those foods. So there are many opportunities that we can grasp, and we could make many of our African foods as fashionable as sushi. Thanks.
Thank you, Cheryl. And you raise a very important point that transformation does not mean throwing out the past and reinventing something new, but there's a lot to celebrate and value and preserve from our current traditions and food systems as we transform, quote unquote. Thank you, Cheryl. I would like to give a heads up to two of the Mmo panel members that I will come to them in a moment for their brief insights, and that is Nachilala Nkombo and Ambassador Carr, and I'll come to you in a moment after I direct the next question over to Asefa. Asefa, a comment has come in from Greenwell Machaya about devising efficient water delivery and utilization systems for sustaining production, given that water is under pressure. And you had been talking about some of the ecological and environmental issues. And I'm curious if you have any comments on the water angle, implications of water, both for production. And also I wonder if you have any comments also on water in terms of clean water for consumption. If you have any comments on the water front, Asefa, it would be helpful to hear. Over to you.
I'm not sure I'm an expert on that, but my general remark on that is there is probably too much demand on water, indeed, both from agriculture and non-agricultural activities. And when we talk about technological development, one of the issues that comes into the picture is the issue of irrigation. And I think, if irrigation is being practiced in the traditional way, then we would be able to really consume much water. But I think now technologies are available where precision agriculture is practiced. And I think in order to really lower at least the demand for water for agriculture, I think technological innovations would be critical in this respect. The availability of water is also related to the climate change, to the natural ecological conditions, and therefore I think we should have mechanisms and we should have policies that will help to really regenerate both ground and underground water, basically. And so, yes, water is a critical input for agriculture, and but I think the use of water, in my opinion, is not as such efficient right at the moment. So technologies would have to be developed, and I think Africa should use existing technologies as well as develop new technologies that will help in really making efficient use of the available water in general. I'm not sure about that, but that's what I could say with regard to that question.
Thank you, Asefa. Thank you for making those key points on technology and water, and we'll come back later on to another question posed from one of your remarks, which is on economics. But let me come at this moment to two of our Mmo panel members, and we're delighted they're here with us today, and we'll share some insights on this overarching question of drivers of African food systems. The first Mmo member panel member I'd like to call on is Nachilala Nkombo, who is Director of WWF in Zambia. Nachilala, over to you.
Thank you so much, Raju, and also to the eminent panelists for sharing very key perspectives around the drivers to the transformation of our African food systems. I just wanted to mention that when we're looking at food systems, sometimes we have a tendency to forget the other aspects in terms of sources of food that go beyond traditional agriculture. When you look at rural communities, forests play a big role in terms of not only supporting sustainable agriculture, but providing food directly, fisheries as well. However, there has been a number of widespread and sustainable methods and approaches in terms of access, use, and management of these key resources. And I think it's critically important that we bring some of these issues under the radar. Related to the subject of water, I would agree with the previous speaker that it's critically important that we manage our water resources and sources very effectively in Africa. In Zambia, where I currently work, we have cases where water basins that support local communities and also the agriculture sector and other sectors in general under enormous pressure because of ecological degradation. So the aspect of being able to track and monitor the health of our water basins is very critical, because if we don't have that on our radar, we might actually lose the step in terms of really ensuring that there's sufficient water to support food production. I also wanted to mention the point around how the competition of water is quite serious with other sectors. Some of the sort of drivers to unsustainable agriculture include basically the industrial drive to produce non-food agriculture items. And most of these are produced quite unsustainably and are produced also for foreign markets. So we need to understand the demand that's within the foreign markets for some of these products, so that we can essentially start tracking the supply chains and building in some sustainability standards and accountability standards for different players across the supply chain, and particularly the ultimate consumers. I would also like to propose that regenerative agriculture, I think, would be key, not only in looking at what needs to be done to restore the land that has become less productive, but also looking at really what are the practices we are promoting, say conservation agriculture. How do we bring in the element of precision farming that was talked about, so that we are in the future have more certainty in terms of the impact of some of the deliberate climate smart agriculture approaches that are promoted. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share perspectives.
Thank you so much, Nachilala. Thank you for the perspectives you shared, and you made several important points, and two of which I'd like to highlight. One is on fisheries, and we have not talked about that under-tapped, I would think, resource or under-tapped component of food systems, and perhaps that's something we can come back to later. And another very important point that I would like to flag is the competition with other sectors. We are sort of assuming food systems is isolated from other sectors, and it is not. So that will be a very important driver of a different nature to food systems. But thank you for your remarks. Before I call on Ambassador Carr, another member of the Mmo panel, I'd like to give a heads up to Asefa and Cheryl that the next two questions I'll be addressing to them will be around the biggest risks to Africa's food systems and to learnings from other parts of the world. So I'll come back to them in a moment. And now other participants, if you'd like to raise questions or make comments, please do utilize the chat box for that purpose. We are eager to hear from you. So let me come to Mmo panel member Ambassador Carr. We welcome your insights. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Madam Facilitator. It is indeed an honor to be part of this very important exchanges. Quickly, there were a couple of insights that are shared by my colleagues. One is the circularity for resilience, which is very, very important and critical. Also, there is lots of discussion around the importance of innovation. I think it is important for us to factor what aspect of innovation that will be relevant for small farm holders. And what I would suggest is to key in the importance of the adoption of frugal innovations to reduce the drudgery of farming. And frugal innovation have worked very well in Southeast Asia, specifically in India. And I think for the African small farmer holders, it is an important aspect of innovation that we should begin to focus and factor in on the farming side, as well as on the value chains, aspects of the value chains of the food system, in terms of getting frugal innovations around technologies for processing, for packaging, and to maintain nutrients and the loss of aspects of food yields. The other aspect that I would like to contribute is to move the discourse of smart agriculture into actual appropriate smartening of the agricultural value chain and the agricultural ecosystems, especially as it relates to scalability scalability and productivity of the food system. Knowledge management and transfer and capturing indigenous knowledge into the food systems. As we all know that the extension worker system has literally collapsed in most of our agriculture, our farming communities. How do we rethink extension workers on different parts of the value chain and the ecosystem, and see how we can rebuild that and encourage the youth and provide the requisite competencies and skills so that they can get back to help as the traditional extension workers used to do. The other aspect that I would like to contribute is the skills development around rebuilding and rethinking TVET institutions and to locate them in farming communities with rethinking of the relevance of the type of curriculum and programs that will focus and situate it, mapped to aspects that are important for scalability, productivity of the food system, building the youth skills around mechanization, around digitalization, around smartened irrigations, around renewable technologies, around agro-processing and even agro-business, not to move the discourse from identifying it as important, but actually making sure that it filters and get into the skill mapping and the skill rebuilding to build capacity and competencies around the ecosystem. Lastly, trading platforms are very important to ensure that we scale and we create value on the yields and produce that comes from the food system. How do we create relevant and appropriate trade platforms that harness emerging technologies around e-commerce, around digital platforms, around services, and make them accessible to the farming actors and agents? How do we ensure that there is an infrastructure for the quality testing mechanisms and safety as well as packaging to help the food systems dependency on importation and to be able to meet our food requirements and have an access to be able to generate and create wealth. My colleague Nakalela talks about water and its importance. I also think that smarter strategies and more innovative strategies around how do we harvest water, how do we manage our limited water resources, how do we share, how do we use technology to monitor the limited resources of water, and how do we equitably distribute them? Also, how do we rethink the current challenges and trends around commercial and big industry fishing? Fishing is very critical and often left aside. How do we now protect the small artisan fishing communities? And how do we ensure that the limited resources of the actors and players who are disadvantaged by this rising big industry and commercial farming around fish that is depleting protein and our fish resources across Africa? This is becoming and emerging to be a crisis issue, and it provides an opportunity for employment for our youth and for our women. How do we strengthen artisan fishing communities is very, very important to to be connected around the food systems,
Thank you.
etc. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ambassador Carr. You raised a number of key issues, some of which we'll pick up in the next roundtable. But this is a segue then to Asefa and to Cheryl. Several questions have come in, but let me begin with one. We've been talking about drivers of food systems. What do you see as the biggest risks to African food systems in the coming years? And I'd like to come over to Cheryl first and then to Asefa. What are the biggest risks you see, not just positive drivers?
Thank you so much, Rachel. I'd list three, I guess. The fact that Africa is still incredibly prone to disasters, be they natural disasters, droughts, floods, locust swarms, various different shocks, but as well as the economic shocks that have been imposed by COVID. And it does show a number of risks, but it also presented some ideas of resilience in the African food system, how particularly local and rural systems were able to continue. So despite the COVID epidemic. The second one, I think, is conflict. And that is a major constraint to food supply in Africa, and of course in certain parts of the continent. But conflict creates problems for neighboring countries as well. It's not just within the country itself. And so it's a cross-border element that does play a significant role in Africa. And we really do need to solve that because it creates a lot of human suffering and particularly compromises children's nutrition. But I think one of the other big changes in the shifts and the trends relates to dietary convergence. And I think that would lead to a major disaster in terms of the biodiversity conservation. And that's why I would strongly promote looking at indigenous diets and looking at the cultural values of each subset within not only within a country, but within regions within a country, because we know that African countries and Africa is not homogenous. There are different pockets, and our values are determined very much by the resources that we have available. And so we really could learn a lot, for example, from Norway's food system approach, where they have designed a whole program to promote consumption of local foods, as well as to look at seasonality of foods and not creating out of season demand for local foods. So trying to think consciously about what we consume to support the cultural diversity, the cultural heritage that we have, and then to prioritize investments that help to support that system. Thank you.
Sure, spot on. And I think you're also looking at the chat box and seeing some questions coming in that I'm going to ask you on COVID, for instance. But three very important risks you put on the table. And I'm glad you did that. Asefa, over to you. Any major risks that you would put on the table that are going to be driving, shaping, influencing food systems in not always positive ways? Over to you, Asefa.
Yeah, I think Sharon has really touched upon on many of the points that I wanted to reflect on. But I think in addition to what Sharon said, I think, that the food system really is dependent on the economic transformation of the continent in general. So I think it is imperative that economic growth has to continue, and this the risk of economic decline, and because of various reasons, for conflicts or externally imposed or internal problems. If there is a lag, it will have serious implication on the food system in general. So economic growth is my. The second point is, I think, how to keep young people in agriculture. I think unless agriculture is changed into a business system, it will be very difficult for young people to really stay in agriculture. So, to what extent would agricultural systems be transformed into a business system rather than a livelihood system? Is another major risk that I think will have implication on the overall food system transformation process. I think there are also in some pockets of Africa, pests and diseases, are very critical challenges. And the manifestation of pests like locust, for instance, in Eastern Africa and the Horn of Africa, for instance, has devastating effect on the overall production and consumption of agricultural products, and therefore, which might be related to the ecological and other issue, similar issue that was raised earlier, is also another major implication. The issue of urbanization that we mentioned earlier is not always positive. I mean, there are risks of obesity, overweight, and this is being visible in many, at least in urban areas and in some high-income groups of society. And so these risks are there. So the double burden of malnutrition is also an issue that would have to be considered as a threat, in my opinion. Thank you very much.
Sefa, thank you. In this conversation, I hope that the next panel is also paying attention, because you are already yielding key policy priorities or key policy options already coming out in this discourse of incentives, of actions, and also of linkages. I would like to ask you to address a second question from the audience, and then I will come to Jim Mmo for a comment that he wishes to make. The second question I'd like you to address is coming in from Wandwasan Tefera, Senior Associate Scientist at Academia. Are there best practices that Africa can learn from for a better food system transformation? Let me slightly elaborate on that question. Africa can learn from within Africa or from outside of Africa? I know that there are places where we have made great progress. So let me ask Cheryl and Asefa if they have any quick comments on best practices that Africa can learn, and then I'll come over to Jim Mmo. Cheryl, over to you first.
Thanks, Rajul. So I made the one comment about Norway and how they've structured their food system approach and encouraging consumers to be mindful of what we consume and trying to prioritize elements around production that focus on that. But I think there are many examples, particularly after the 2007-2008 high food price crisis. Many countries did implement many programs. Rwanda, of course, is the star, with many different processes that looked at entire value chain development. So not just focusing on production, but making sure that producers had a market to go to. There are many examples of aggregation, for example, that countries have implemented. And yeah, the Mmo reports are crammed full of really productive examples from across the continent. Each report profiling at least 6 countries who have made remarkable steps in improving their food systems in particular components, whether it be the use of digitization, whether it be livestock production, or the use of mechanization. So there are many, many examples, but perhaps across countries we don't share enough amongst each other to profile those particular opportunities. But there are many, many examples. In the digitization report from the Mmo Panel, there are 35 African initiatives on using digitization to improve food systems. So if we're looking for resources, that's where we should be heading as a start. Thanks, Rajul.
Thank you, Cheryl. And perhaps our colleagues at Academia can also share links to these key resources to continue this discourse. Let me come over to Asefa. Any thoughts from your side, Asefa?
I don't have much comment on this one. I think the food system is relatively a new concept to some extent, because it integrates many things. It integrates all elements. It integrates environment, people, inputs, processes, and activities, and what have you. So I would not expect, a very highly sophisticated food system in its entirety. There could be examples in different forms. In the use of digitalization, for instance, or in the use of water, in the use of mechanization. There could be practices in many places, good practice in many places. The use of water, for instance, drip irrigation in Israel is a frequently mentioned success story, for instance. So I'm not sure whether we really have what we call best practices in the entirety, in the entirety of the food system itself. So, but bits and pieces are available in many places. Different practices are available at different levels, at different inputs, or at the process level, at the production level, at the on the environment level, and so on and so forth. So in terms of its holistic practice, at least I'm not aware of a very successful practice that we could mention.
Thank you. You're very right, I think, Assefa, and it is that holistic aspect that I think is motivating also the UN Food System Summit itself, you know, trying to put the pieces together. I would like to call on Jim Emke to make brief remarks, and then I'll come back and give a final question to Cheryl and Assefa, and I give them a heads up what that final question will be. That final question will be coming in from Andrea Dutoit from the University of Pretoria on how food systems in Africa can adjust for future global concerns. So let me now first turn to Jim. Jim, any comments, brief comments you'd like to make? And Jim is, of course, well known to many of us with USAID and Senior Food Security and Nutrition Advisor. Jim, welcome. We welcome your brief remarks. Over to you.
Thank you very much. What a wonderful meeting. What a wonderful event. And I really don't want to make remarks more as much as ask a question. So thank you for that opportunity. So the first, I've been observing the discussion of technical innovation, but less discussion of process innovation, and particularly with respect to policy process innovation. So on the one side, I would be interested in the presenter's thoughts as to whether or not inaccurate or ineffective policy is a risk to the transformation of food systems. And on the positive side, I would like to get their thoughts on whether or not process innovation to build more inclusive policy systems is also important to food systems transformation and sustainability, particularly as we ask the food systems to do many things beyond just agricultural development, nutrition, the double burden of nutrition, climate sustainability, and many of the other things that speakers have mentioned. Thank you very much. I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Jim. Cheryl and Assefa, Jim has raised some very interesting questions. So let me turn back to the two of you. And let me begin with Cheryl and come over to Assefa. Any reflections on Jim's question?
Yeah, sure. We know Jim is one of our institutional arrangements specialists. So thank you, Jim, for your question. Absolutely. One of the things that strikes me in the work that we've been doing on the Food Systems Summit preparation is that in Africa, we have the CAADP investment plans, the National Investment Plans for Agriculture and Food Security. And many of the most successful countries that have been shown, for example, in the Mmo's nutrition report on how we can end hunger in Africa, that the most successful countries are those that have integrated planning and monitoring systems at the highest level in government. But what strikes me about those NAB coordination systems is that they haven't yet embraced the food system as a whole. And so the food system organization and institutional arrangements require more than what the CAADP Malabo requirements did, because now you're integrating even more different sectors in the government that needs a new kind of thinking about the organizational arrangement. And we've seen with national dialogues as well, the coordinators shifting from the Ministry of Agriculture to a much higher level, primarily in foreign affairs or in the president's office. And I think this is something that food systems is going to lead, is a new kind of institutional arrangement that requires far more coordination of data, of thinking, of policies, to make sure that all sectors of government are working towards more sustainable production and consumption and overall more sustainable food systems than what we have seen in the past. So it will require a great deal more coordination and a lot more thinking as to how we look at the trade-offs, because however you look at the food system, you realize that governments are making trade-offs. You're either investing in health, or you're investing in production and soil health. I think the point that Greenwell made around the water nexus is something that illustrates the complexity of the decisions that have to be made at a policy level in the food system. So I think we're going to need a lot more innovation in terms of institutional arrangements for food systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. Key points. Over to you, Asefa, your reflections.
I don't have much to add to what Sharon has said. I think risks are there, obviously. I mean, not only in terms of formulating appropriate policies to transform the food system, but also implementation. Implementation challenges are always there. And I think many African governments are quite known for, weak implementation of policies. And so the risk is there because, as I said earlier, this concept is much more complicated, much more complex. And I think policy readiness is critical. So if African governments fail to have appropriate policies that could respond to demands, obviously that would be a risk. With regard to the inclusivity question, obviously I think this is a very good question. This is a very good suggestion. Yes, it has to be inclusive as much as possible. So the participation of the main actors in the system would have to be integrated, but this requires a lot of coordination, as was said earlier by Cheryl. And in addition, the concept itself is new to many African policymakers, and a lot of research, a lot of evidence is required in order to formulate and to put appropriate policies on the table. So yes, there are risks. Obviously, even the policies that have been produced with regard to traditional agricultural system have not been implemented in many ways in Africa. There are a number of continental policies as well as national policies. The implementation is weak in many cases, in many instances. So it's not only formulating policies, but also implementing those policies on the ground is a big challenge and a big risk, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Asif. An absolutely critical point, and that will feed into the second roundtable on policy priorities. We can come up with priorities galore, but if we cannot implement them, that's going to be the key challenge. Colleagues, we are running out of time over here. This is such an incredible panel. I will take one last person for this round from the floor, and then we will give Cheryl and Asefa a chance to make the final takeaway message. This last person I will take will be Shailaja Fannel from the University of Cambridge. Shailaja, we look forward to your brief remarks. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Rajul. I really appreciate it. I found it such a rich and valuable discussion. In the space that I work, I've been working on millets across both East and West Africa. And I've been talking with my colleague, Michel Ganem, who's at UMF6. And one of the big challenges we feel is that Africa needs to think about opportunity not to allow orphan crops to remain orphan crops. Many of the large organizations look at pearl millet or finger millet, or they look at amaranth, they look at single features. The point that Professor Hendricks make, I think, is core. The idea of the richness of the African plates across different parts of the continent are very important in linking the aspect of food production with food consumption, to give the notion of the heritage, the past, to the ideas of smartness. And I put this in my commentary in the feedback. Smart people is what makes smart villages or smart cities. So please, can we put the core of our knowledge systems in this region and particularly not allow further loss of biodiversity. So working with those crops that we know are valuable. So amaranth could be a superfood, like quinoa was a superfood. There is so much in the food systems that we could bring together. I will keep my remarks short, but I think linking the economics to the culture, to the technical, is the core. Thank you so much, Rajul.
Thank you. Thank you for that extraordinary point, and I'm so glad we had the chance to hear from you. Colleagues, this has been an incredible session. Let me give the final word to Cheryl and Asefa, and I'll go in that reverse order. Your final takeaway message, Cheryl, that you'd like to leave the audience with, and then to Asefa. Over to you.
Thank you. I think we do need to think smartly. We really do have to think about, we have to anticipate change and start to work towards that change. If we let it happen without managing that change, we might wake up in a very different world, and a world that we might regret. That in which biodiversity is lost, our cultural heritage is lost, and the world is much poorer for that. So I really do think we can do a lot to shape the future, but we need to start with training people in schools, and we need to make sure we include food systems in African universities' curricula, so that the next generation of professionals, whether they be in academia, on policy, or in the business world, are clued up on what we really want and what our vision for the African food system is in future. Thank you, Rajul.
Thank you, Cheryl. Over to you, Asefa.
Yeah, I mean, my main message is really the same what I said earlier. I think the food system is still an unfinished agenda, and the understanding of this system is still low, and therefore, in my opinion, we need in Africa more research, more evidence that will help policymakers to design, appropriate policies that would be able to really meet the dynamics in the food system. So research and evidence production is critical, so that the African policymakers would be able to formulate responsive policies, or policies that really meet the demand. Secondly, as was said earlier by Cheryl and the other colleague, regarding the indigenous crops or orphan crops, I think the case of teff is a very good example. Teff is indigenous to Ethiopia, and it has not been supported by the research system for a very long time. But now teff is a super crop even in Europe, and there are a number of crops like these ones that could really help in meeting the food demand of the continent, as well as the global community in general. So more support again for indigenous knowledge, for indigenous crops and systems is also very important and critical. So I think investment should go along those lines as well, in my opinion. Thank you very much.
Super. Thank you, Asefa. I'm sure everyone in the audience, you will agree with me that both Asefa and Cheryl have led us to a very interesting discourse, a very important discourse on drivers of food systems. We will have another roundtable that will delve into the opportunities and policy priorities. At this moment, I would like to first thank our speakers. And two, I would like to ask all of you in the audience to please open your camera so that we can take a group photo, and then we will have a brief break thereafter. But please, all participants, give us the opportunity to have a group photo. Please open your cameras, and our organizers will take a group photo. I know you're all out there, so do not be shy. Open your cameras. Go for it, everyone, so we can have a nice picture. All participants, not just the speakers, all participants. Go for it, please. Let's see you all.
Yes.
Nabu, are we having the picture we want?
We'll be taking 2 shots. So thank you, everyone. Tijan, I'll be doing the countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The second one is coming. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much, everyone. Back
Excellent.
to you, Rajul.
Thank you. Excellent. Please stay, take a short break, 10-minute break, and then we will resume with Roundtable 2. And if it is anything like Roundtable 1, I can guarantee you it will be a rich, substantive, insightful discussion that you do not want to miss and that you want to be part of. 10 minutes, we are on again. Join us, please. See you in 10 minutes. Thank you, everyone.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will be resuming soon for the second part of this session, Roundtable 2. We are still Yes. Okay. So thank you for staying with us. We will be starting now. I would like to hand over to Rajul Panjalorj, our facilitator for the second roundtable. Raju?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nabu. Welcome back, everyone. I'm sure you'll agree with me that the first roundtable was really intense, exciting, and I can promise you the second one will be similarly. If you have not had a chance to look at the chat comments, because there were great insights there as well, please do so, or watch the video in case you missed it, because really very interesting. So we are now in roundtable 2, and this roundtable will focus on the opportunities and the policy options for food systems transformation in Africa. As with the first roundtable, panelists will offer brief introductory remarks and will then engage in a brief moderated conversation among us and then take questions and comments from you in the audience. And then the panelists will conclude with their final takeaway messages. We welcome your questions and comments at any time. Please submit them in the chat box, as Nabu has mentioned earlier. Provide your name and affiliation. We will come to as many of them as we can during the Q&A session. We are eager to hear from you and learn from you, so do not be shy. Submit your questions and comments. So without further ado, I'd like us to begin roundtable 2. And the central question that we are posing in this roundtable, and we are asking our panelists to address, is what are the top 3 opportunities and policy options for transforming food systems in Africa? And we are really particularly eager to hear of game-changing solutions and policy options. So without further ado, I'd like to call on the first panelist, and this is Dr. Fadi Abdelradi, Associate Professor at the Department of Agricultural Economics at the Faculty of Agriculture at Cairo University. Fadi, we are eager to hear your insights on this central question. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rajul. It was a great first round table with lots of information and ideas that I'm going to address and build on as well.
Thank you. We will address that.
Part. Yes. So I'm going to group the policy-related topics into 3 groups. The first group is policies related to supply chain governance and labor markets. And in this regard, a few points that I'm going to mention here, which are we need to focus on policy-related aspects in terms of smallholder farmers, because the smallholder farmers are the backbone of the agricultural sector in Africa, and they are represent the majority. So we need to look for innovative organizational aspects to organize the relationship among farmers and agricultural cooperatives, and adopt a circular and short supply chain concepts. So this is one point. Another thing is we need to address
Fadi, excuse me for interrupting you. Yes. Participants cannot hear you. Okay. Can you speak louder if it's possible?
Yeah, is it clear now?
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. If you don't mind, make brief reference to your first point, because not everybody could hear that first point you made.
Sure. So the first point was about the that agriculture in Africa is based on controlled or managed by smallholder farmers, which are representing the majority of the sector. So in this regard, we need an innovative organizational aspects to manage the relationship among farmers and agricultural cooperatives, and apply circular and short supply chains, for example, as a solution. Another point is that agriculture in Africa is labor intensive. So the points regarding the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the production and in subsequent channels and components like the industry and downstream the supply chain, how it's being impacted. So the food system, how to integrate because of the human factor. So we need policies related to health and to protect and insurance policies to protect the involved with labor. As well, we need to think about policies that tackles generational renewal issues and farm labor involvement under the lack of farm successor problems. So it's a social dimension on the farm level. So we need to find solutions, as Asefa was mentioning, and Cheryl was talking about the idea and the point of involving youth. So how do we target youth and make agriculture for them as to think of it as a business rather than thinking of it as a craft. So how do we encourage the youth and to be involved and to use solutions, innovative solutions like digitalization solutions to improve the capacity and implement techniques that are more efficient. We need policies that, of course, there already this point was covered related to the urbanization and population growth and the demand for higher quality food and jobs. But in this point as well, I want to refer to the idea of food integrity, which covers authenticity and food safety. These two indicators are essential in modern food systems: authenticity and food safety, and how to ensure that the food that is delivered and received to the by the consumers are authenticated and safe for consumption. I'm still in the part related to the governance component. So yeah, another interesting policy focus as well is to investigate the idea of the rainbow revolution. So the concept that comes from Asia that we focus on, for example, the green revolution, the yellow revolution, the white revolution, and so on, which is related to milk production, honey production, vegetables and fruits, and so on. So a focus on the specialization, the idea that territorial approach or the territorial value chains, that specific locations in Africa that has a competitive advantage in producing specific crops or food products. Moving to the second component, which is the evidence-based policies, and this is one of the essential points that research that needs to be based on empirical evidence. And to do that, we need to understand the synergies and trade-offs between food, water, energy, and ecosystem. Synergies and trade-offs, and this a lot of work in this regard, and this framework has been introduced recently and receiving a lot of attention now as a tool to assess the interlinkages among institutionally at the institutional level, the competition over natural resources, the adoption of lean, agile, resilient, and green methodologies, growing competition on the natural resources I already mentioned, improving the access to data and data quality using remote sensing technologies. And this is one of the things that I'm partnering now, a partnership with every Egypt on a project of setting up an agricultural foresight policy unit that is composed of partners from academia, from the industry, and from the government, especially the Ministry of Agriculture, to develop policy, to design policies for the ministry in a way that is evidence-based, using different kinds of advanced models like CGE modeling and so on.
To wrap up now, Fadi.
Yes, the last point is policies related to market and trade. So we need to focus on the volatility of global markets that require new approaches related to trade and storage systems, the growth of the growing double burden of malnutrition, or the triple burden of malnutrition, and finally that I already mentioned, the food integrity, safety, and authenticity. So thank you very much. There are other things I want to cover, but maybe in a later stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Fadi. Definitely we'll come back in the Q&A, but you put on the table key institutional governance, evidence-based policies, and other policies also outside of the agriculture sector. Very important points. So let me come to our second panelist, and this is Professor John Asafu Ajayi, Senior Fellow and Head of Research at the African Center for Economic Transformation, ACET. John, over to you for your brief remarks.
Thank you very much, Rajul. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, good. So for me, the top three opportunities and policy actions to transform Africa's food systems are: one, leveraging technological innovations to transform the agro-processing sector, and this is along the entire value chain. Secondly, to improve market linkages, and then thirdly, to invest in food systems R&D. I know I've got 3 minutes, so if I can't finish, I'll pick things up in the next round. So let me start off with a study that we've just done here at ACET. We've just completed a 2-country study on market linkages, and our case study countries were Ghana and Kenya. So we came up with some interesting findings, some of which have been actually picked up by earlier speakers in the first panel. One, we found that upgrading the value chain can unlock significant opportunities which will drive overall food system transformation, and I'll come back to that. Secondly, and this has also been raised by the earlier speakers, there has been a diet shift, and this has come about because of increasing urbanization. And this is actually impacting food markets and smallholder farmers, and Fadi spoke about smallholder farmers, who comprise over more than 80% of the food producers, are hard-pressed to meet the emerging needs. So, for example, urbanization has seen a rise in demand for easy-to-prepare foods such as rice and wheat. However, these are temporary crops which smallholder farmers cannot produce in tropical climates. So, which means that a lot of these foods are being imported, and it's increasing the import bill. The other thing we found was that the markets are getting formalized. In a lot of countries, we've seen a rise of supermarkets, and instead of going to the market to buy food, now a lot of urban dwellers are now going into supermarkets. And we find that smallholder farmers are being crowded out by medium and large-scale producers, which raises issues for the agricultural sector. The other development is that export markets are also increasingly demanding traceability and compliance with private standards, and smallholder farmers are finding the challenge to meet these new demands. So what should be the policy response? Well, there are quite a few things that can be done, but the theme that I want to dwell on is that we can actually leverage innovations in various ways. One, we can help use innovations to increase access to mechanized farming. A good example is a new app in Ghana, which is called Trotro Tractor, which allows a farmer to dial a tractor to come to their farm to do work. Also, some of these innovations are helping farmers through apps such as mobile money and so forth to get access to finance and insurance. But there's actually a need to develop an insurance part of it. Also, there's the opportunity to access market information, including climate information. There's also an opportunity to reduce the activities of middlemen. Now, middlemen actually come between rural producers and urban food markets, and this actually increases transactions costs. So in Ghana, they've recently established a commodity exchange, which is called the Ghana Commodity Exchange. This was launched in 2018, and it covers 5 crops: maize, soybean, sorghum, and sesame. And so commodity exchange actually provides links farmers to the wider market and reduces the influence of middlemen. The other thing that we can also
John,
do,
wrap up in a moment.
Yes.
Okay.
Also. So to wrap up, We can also help farmers to increase access to supermarkets, and I'll come back to this later. This is by establishing certification systems for smallholders. So I think I'll hand over back to you, Rahul, and pick this up later. Thank you.
Perfect. And I'm very glad you made your 3 points right at the very beginning: leveraging technology options across the entire value chain, improving market linkages, and investing in food systems R&D, and they're all interconnected points. We'll come back to that later. Let me now call on our third panelist, and this is Professor Simba Sibanda, who is the Nutrition Thematic Leader at the Food, Agricultural and Natural Resources Policy Analysis Network, FANRAPAN. Over to you, Simba, for your remarks.
Thank you, Rachel. Let me just pick on, well, I'll keep it very short. There was reference, I think Cheryl dwelt on this for some time, on the value of traditional foods and going back, if you like, to our foods which are localized and are more nutritious. Now, the one opportunity I see there related to that is a policy dimension that will support farmers to produce more nutritious foods by supporting neglected food value chains. If you look at the major, food value chains, we're talking maize, we're talking rice, and possibly cassava to some extent, but mostly wheat. Those three, they're well developed, great market support, the kind of products that come out of them in terms of processing, they're well established. So you create all sorts of products, convenient foods, and they're the major staples. Now, when you look at the traditional foods, the things that we are so romantically referring to as more nutritious and things that served us well, and we want to go back there, although the current generations probably never experienced that food, is that these have now become elitist foods. They kind of occupy niche markets. So farmers are not producing these enough. The value chains are not that well developed. Even the utilization and product development is not that great. So we see that we need to produce convenient foods. Can we produce convenient foods from these products? I mean, the product development has not been that advanced. So we are probably still stuck with the traditional uses of these foods, which actually are not going to fit into the environment that is being created. Urbanization, increased middle class, increased income, but at the same time, more pressure on the production environment. So that's one point. The second point is that I believe that if you look at the global level, and indeed Africa, there is a growing supermarket culture. A lot of our food systems are controlled by a few multinational corporations that are involved in the agri-food business. And we all talk about ultra-processed foods, high salt, high sugar. And so we want to find a way through policy instruments, a way to engage the private sector so that they are not the source of problem, but they are a solution to our food systems. Because we can see that more and more the supermarkets are, going to be spreading right into the village. So we don't want to have supermarkets that are actually causing more problems in terms of the diets. So it's important that we bring them to the table and have them as solution providers. And I think this is related to the issue of food governance, how we can make this inclusive and make sure that the products that are being produced obviously as close as possible to what people desire and consider as good food. And the third point is that, and this is something we've seen from COVID-19, the need to build capacity of local food supply systems, because the longer the chain, the more vulnerable it is to disruptions. We saw countries, particularly within Southern Africa, with COVID restrictions across borders, countries that depended on imports actually ended up not getting enough food for their populations. So that again is an opportunity for the local farmers to be able to move into that space, but they will need some policy support. I think I'll stop there for now. I've got a few other points, but we can take them later.
Super. Thank you so much, Simba. Colleagues, we have a fourth panelist, but he's running a little bit late, and I will bring him in during the time of the Q&A or as soon as he shows up, and we will hear from him. And this is Dr. Karim El Ainoui. So let's move to a little bit of a conversation with our three other panelists, Fadi, John, and Simba. And they've all raised very interesting issues. So I would like to ask you in the audience, please submit your questions and comments. We welcome them. We will come to them in a few minutes and have a chance to hear from you. Do not be shy, but in the meantime, let me have a little bit of a conversation with these three panelists and push them a little bit. I'm sure they will welcome that. I would like to start with Simba and then work backwards to John and Fadi. But Simba, in the previous panel, there had been quite a lot of discussion about nutritious diets, healthy diets, affordability of diets, and you have raised these issues yourself. Let me push you on policy options. Policy options to support, as you mentioned, neglected food value chains, policy options to make food governance more inclusive, policy options to build the capacity of local food supply systems. If I was to push you on what would be your number one or number two policy option that we really need to invest in, what would come to your mind to address these issues? Over to you, Simba.
Okay, thank you, Rajil. If I can take the first point that I raised, which is really to support farmers so that they can produce more nutritious food, I've got a good example where if we're talking small grains, I moved to buying small grains, but when I walk into a supermarket, I find that they occupy a small shelf space. So, and they're actually much more expensive than they should be. If you consider these are traditional foods. And the reason for that is that there's not enough volumes of those products coming through. And the people that have realized their nutritional value are actually people that can actually afford to buy alternatives, but they're preferring to buy this because they know the value. So if we're talking about undernutrition, which you'll find mostly among the low-income groups, who are the people who should actually be eating more of these foods, they're actually out of reach. So, and that's because the value chain is not that well developed. And private sector is not gonna move into that. It's a chicken and egg thing because they don't see an opportunity to make profits. So I'm looking at the public sector actually investing in that to kickstart these value chains. You know, use public sector purse to go in there, reduce the amount of risk that is there so that the private sector can come in and begin to drive the value chain, which is the normal, way things should work in business. So that is one. On the issue of the, multi sort of large corporations who are involved in the food industry, I think we see there's a need to bring them to the table. I know they're very powerful, but only government can actually tackle, these people. I know that there have been policies that have been set up, like the sugar tax and various other, taxes. I mean, you put a sugar tax in beverages, like they've done in South Africa, but that sugar finds its way through other products. So it's not really making a big difference to the diet of, individuals. So one needs to look at this, look at the whole value chain and try and plug the holes and increase enforcement. So if you put a label on a food to say this will deliver this nutrient or this benefit, without actually enforcement, you actually, are just playing cosmetics because people will go and label and they can turn around, facts. I was just reading a piece this morning where it was talking about, this kind of practice. I'm not saying every corporation is guilty of this, but this does happen. We have a lot of food safety, food standards laws, but Africa is not very strong in enforcement and tracking compliance. So I'll just stop there for now.
Yeah. Thank you, Simba. You raised the key issue we'll come back to later. We can design policies, but what if we cannot implement to enforce them? But let me come back to John now. John, you raised 3 key points and you started to discuss them, but let me push you on the policies. Policy changes, the policies we need to actually do what you mentioned. 2 of your points were on leveraging technology and investing in R&D. What would be the policy options that you would put on the table there that we don't already have or that you'd like to highlight? Over to you, John.
Okay, so let me take the last one first, which is investing in R&D. Despite the high returns to agriculture, African governments have generally underinvested in agriculture in terms of agricultural expenditure. Despite the commitments at the Malabo conference to increase, to spend at least 10% of national budgets on agriculture, very few countries have made that commitment. And many countries, including mine, Ghana, are spending far less on agriculture and even far less on research and development into agriculture and food systems. So what I'd like to see is really for the government to live up to their commitments and to increase expenditure on R&D, especially research into crops, for example. Most of these research expenditures have actually come from donors. And what I would like to see is the establishment of a sustainable national research funding, or even maybe scale it up across the continent, whereby agriculture is fully funded in terms of research and development. And this will help us to develop new crops, which can withstand temperature and also lack of water and disease, and also to be able to withstand diseases. So that's one thing I'd like to see. The other point that I wanted to make is on the issue of reforms. Because what we found in our study was that smallholder farmers face a lot of market barriers in terms of getting food from the farm to the market and to the urban areas. And this is arising out of challenges such as logistics, lack of infrastructure, challenges with transportation, the market failures across the value chain, and access to information, market information, price information, and so forth. And all these are actually increasing the transaction cost for farmers. So what I would like to see really as a matter of urgency, policies to address some of these market failures. This does not necessarily mean that government has to come in and do it all, but what our government needs to do is actually to make it easier for the private sector to play a bigger role along the value chain. And because of course the private operators are operating on profit, and they only go where they can make profit. So what government has to do is to actually make it easy for private players to come in. And so innovative policies to encourage private players to come into the value chain. This will also create jobs for young people. And this is an area where innovation can also be applied in terms of things. I also already talked about access to credit, but even things such as logistics and market information and so forth can all be, these roles can be played by private entrepreneurs who can at the same time create jobs, especially for young people. This has been mentioned in the past. So this is something that young people could be attracted to and make a living to reduce unemployment.
Thank you, John. Thank you for that, and we'll come back to one of your points later on reforms. But let me come to Fadi now. Fadi, John's last point on youth is actually a segue into a question that I would like to raise, which has also already come in from the audience. And this is a question that's come in also from Sangare Sadatu, economist at CAPEG, where he notes about how can we motivate young people to be interested in the agricultural sector. You've also mentioned that in your remarks about how to engage youth. Could I ask you on the policy options to do so? What would you put on the table in terms of policies to encourage, motivate, support young people to engage more effectively in the agricultural sector? Over to you, Fadi.
Thank you very much, Jules. Very important question about involving youth in the agriculture sector, or to be involved in and transform farming into and deal with it as a business, as an agribusiness. So on one side, to to attract youth to join and to participate and to develop a new and to intervene with their ideas is to teach them in the university level as a beginning. So at the higher educational level, there should be a policy that teach the undergraduates about entrepreneurship, agricultural entrepreneurship, and how the agricultural entrepreneurship can contribute to the to build your own business and what are the benefits of setting up a business and how to generate profit from it. So this is on one side, one policy intervention is to promote this. And to give you a case study about this, here in Egypt, the Cairo University has already started this initiative, and we are teaching now in the university courses related to how to set up a business, what the ideas or the basics of entrepreneurship, and how and link. Actually, we are setting up an agribusiness incubator in the faculty, connected with the Agricultural Bank of Egypt, to support the youth, the graduates of the agricultural faculty, to set up their business, to set up a business in agriculture. So this is one of the solutions that can contribute and to attract youth into being involved in the agricultural sector.
Thank you very much, Fadi. And I would like to come back to the three of you as panelists. And again, in the audience, I encourage you, if you'd like to submit questions or raise your hand to speak, just give us a signal. But I'd like to come back to the three of you. In a sense, the three of you focused your remarks primarily within agriculture. And we've been talking about policy options to transform food systems within the agricultural sector. But do you see important opportunities outside of the agricultural sector in Africa that we could tap or should tap into to transform food systems in Africa? Is there anything that would come to your mind that you feel like, wow, this is a big game-changing opportunity or a big policy options outside of agriculture now? I know that Fadi and had already started to talk about trade policies, but I want to ask you, what would come to your mind about big policy options that we should open our mind to and call for action beyond the agricultural sector? Fadi, shall I start with you? Because you had mentioned earlier trade policies. Do you want to comment on that? And then I'll come to John and Simba.
Yes. So one solution here is for the trade part, especially the again. Let me give this with an example, applied example. In Egypt, the Ministry of Agriculture has one unit that that focuses on that has a council for agricultural exports, and this would require applying a codification system for the smallholder farmers, and this would need to have youth to be involved in the inspection and the establishment of companies to understand the trading restrictions and the export windows. So they need to from coming outside from agricultural or technical aspect, focusing on learning about international trade and the export opportunities and market windows and market information, and opening partnerships and collaboration with import companies from Europe, for example. This is an essential component, and there's a promotion now and support from the government for the youth to establish export companies that they rely on high quality food products, like especially in the cash crops of fruits and vegetables.
Thank you, Fadi. Let me come over to you, John. Any insights from your side of big policy options to explore outside of agriculture?
Yes, Raju. One issue which has bothered me for some time, and which has been mentioned by the previous panel, is the issue of shifting diets. So here in Ghana, we've seen that there's been a shift from traditional foods such as sorghum and millet to foods such as rice, maize, wheat. And previous speakers have also raised this issue that this is actually causing health problems. So for example, in Ghana, diabetes is one of the fastest growing non-communicable diseases. And this is due to diet changes and people, urban families, finding it easy to go for these easy to prepare foods or already prepared foods, most of which are imported and have high sugar content. So that's creating a health problem. And I think this is something that government need to address. So far, I haven't seen anything, at least in my country, of anything being done. But I think there's a need for an awareness and education. Of course, the shifting diets is also caused by the forces which are beyond the control of everyone. But I think we've got to weigh this against the National Health Bill and the toll that it's taking on the health expenditures, and also just to improve general well-being. I think the issue of diets is a very important one. And at the moment, I don't have ready answers, but because it's really outside my field. But I think that's something that we need to think about and come up with solutions. So over to you, Raju.
Thank you, John. You raised a very important point, and I think that falls right into the bailiwick of Simba. So Simba, any comments on your side of policy options outside of agriculture? We already talked a little bit about health, but over to you, Simba.
Yeah, thank you, Raju. I think, the last comment really is critical, because when we're talking food systems, the tendency is to just think agriculture, but you want to look at food systems kind of like a value chain model, because you're starting off at the farm, and by the time that food is consumed, it's gone through very many sort of steps and processes, and various stakeholders are participating in that. And in some cases, it's so far from the farm, you can't even recognize the product. And so there are a number of points, if you look at that value chain, there are a number of points where you can intervene and make a difference. And also the linkages between the food systems and of course the area of health has just been mentioned, and the fact that today your non-communicable diseases are probably the biggest cause of mortalities globally. So everybody must be interested in that. So there are solutions there, but I want to zero in on that value chain approach and show that when we're talking about involving youth, for instance, in the food system rather than in agriculture, it opens up all sorts of possibilities, because every time you talk agriculture, youth probably associate this with drudgery, low income, poverty, and even our education system. When I went to school, the last thing I wanted to do was to be on the farm. I wanted to get away from there as fast and as quickly as possible. But looking back now, I'll probably have a different reaction to that. And so we can have youth participating on the agriculture food system value chain, where they are involved as entrepreneurs, as input suppliers. They can also be middle people or middlemen, as people were calling them, which are considered a swear word, but I think they're important part of the system because they provide the market and linkages to main markets, which the farmers themselves are not able to do, and they shouldn't. And so we can have youth, and with digitization, there are all sorts of opportunities there to create market linkages, to be involved in local trade, and also to develop, the local food system in a way that it fits into the main food system, into trade, and you have a balance there. So there's an opportunity for all players to get involved in that, whether it's, cross-border trade or intra-regional trade, to try and balance, the food basket internally, but also taking cognizance that it's important to have a local food system which is proofed against any embargoes that may come because of a pandemic like COVID. So there's a lot of room to play there in things that are non-agricultural. Then the food health nexus, very critical, very important. And that needs to put pressure on the food system to change, to transform. If anything has power to transform the food system, is the impact of what we are eating on our health and the well-being of people in general. So there are all sorts of opportunities there. We can work with the health partners coming from agriculture, and also work with people in social security, for instance. We need to make sure that food aid is delivering good diets to those that are vulnerable. So yeah, I can make all the linkages, and at every point, there's an opportunity to put a policy intervention that will actually deliver some solution. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Simba. I'd like to turn over for a moment now to our audience. And I have to say, I recognize several people, and I'm going to put them on the spot if they wish to make a comment. And others, if you'd like me to call on you, please give us a signal. So I happen to see a photo of Lawrence Haddad. So Lawrence, I will give you a heads up that I'd like to really call on you and hear your views, your insights on this big question of opportunities and policy options to transform food systems in Africa. Lawrence Haddad, Executive Director for GAIN. Love to hear your remarks. Over to you, Lawrence.
Thank you, Rajul. Never mind being put on the spot by you. You know, I'm very sorry I was late. I was at we were at an Action Track Chair meeting, which went on for 2 hours. It would have been much more interesting to be in your meeting than the one I was in. I mean, you know, there are so many things that can be done to transform food systems in Africa and everywhere. It's kind of hard to know where to start. And I think one of the reflections from engaging with the member states in the Food Summit so far, and from listening to David Nabarro, who's helping convene the national dialogues, is that, you know, a lot of the member states, not just in Africa but all over the world, food systems are a relatively new concept, and everyone's struggling with, you know, what are they? What do my food systems look like in my country? Which are the bits that need fixing and strengthening, and how do I do that? And that's kind of a journey. It's something that can be initiated at the summit coming up in September, the Food System Summit, but it's not something, you know, it will take time. And a lot of it is very context specific. Yes, there's some important international dimensions to it around climate and trade and security, but a lot of it is national, driven by national needs, national opportunities, national politics. And when I think of think tanks, when I think of them in Europe and North America and elsewhere, they're so influential at doing two things, two of the three things that I think needs to happen for change to happen. First for change to happen, you need an organization that's going to do analysis of the current situation. Because often a report or an index or a survey will make everyone wake up from their stupor and say, oh, we have a problem. We have a bigger problem we thought we had, or the problem we thought we had over here is actually over here, or the problem we thought we had with this age group is actually with this age group. So I think think tanks can really generate media relevant, accessible wake-up calls for everyone in society, not just for governments. The second thing think tanks can really do is generate a constant stream of solutions. You know, you can generate solutions, you can harvest solutions from the hardcore science and academic literature, and you're a link, you're a pipeline from the science to the policy. You're at the interface of science and policy and economics and policy. And these two things are so important. The third thing is you know, political opportunity. When there's a regime change or someone leaves an office and someone new enters an office. So you get these three things: the problems, the articulation of the problems, the articulation of the solutions, and then the opportunity, because something shifts in the political landscape. And think tanks are so vital to these first two. So my question, it was a long preamble, sorry, but my question really is, what is it that can make think tanks in Africa better equipped to generate or to contribute to those first two things, the articulation of the problem and the articulation of the solution? For sure, money is one of them, I'm sure, but are there other things that are more institutional or more systemic that can be unlocked? And if you can identify them, perhaps the summit can help to create momentum for them to be unlocked. Back to you, Rachel.
Lauren. Thank you, Lawrence. Always very interesting to hear you, and thank you for putting that question on the table. I would like the panelists to hold on to that question for a moment of Lawrence. What is it that can make think tanks in Africa contribute to articulating the problem and the solution? Because I see our fourth panelist has just joined us. And I would like to call on our fourth panelist to also offer his brief remarks on the big opportunities and policy actions for transforming food systems in Africa. And if he also wishes to comment on Lawrence's question at the same moment, great. And then I give a heads up that I will call on Racine Lai and on Assem Abu Hatab, who had raised hands for their remarks. But now let me introduce Karim Al-Nawi, who is with us from the Executive President of the Policy Center for the New South, and I'm very glad he has joined us. Karim, over to you for your remarks and reflections on Lawrence's question at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, and a proud member of the Mmo Panel as well. Sorry to join late, but the organizers were aware, so my apologies. On the think tank, I just catch the discussion. I think we should see think tanks are public goods, so they should be subsidized. This is my, I think every country in a way should own public money or a mechanism that is belongs to the third sector, not official institutions. So they need to have the space and the political space to operate. At the same time, if you're completely dependent on external funding, you don't work on your own priority. So the project of the Policy Center for the New South, if I can say a few words, we might be one of the largest think tanks in Africa today. It's about 120 people. 80% of those are full-time staff, and the others gives us on average about 50% of their time. Is a way also to look at the world from Africa, because I don't want to sound too sort of third world Bandung spirit, but there is a bit of militantism in that. That Africa needs to have its own narrative, and it works on its own priority from its own perspective, while maintaining and keeping an open and respectful and tolerant and fact-based and empirical dialogue. So really for us, the question for Africa is really about how we can improve public policies domestically first, and of course continentally as well. So the complexity of public policy is often underestimated, and it needs to be acknowledged. And think tanks should be, I'm not talking about advocacy think tank, which can be respectful, but I'm talking about sort of semi-academic think tanks close to decision-making that are here to sort of contribute to better public policies. And I think they're much needed in many countries of Africa. They can be of different size. But they need to have the freedom to work on their own priority from their own perspective. I think it is important, and it's a nice way to relate to the rest of the world, to bring in expertise, a sort of platform where you mix and you reach out to the world and you bring the world to your country, always with the notion and that it is to improve public policies and to enter in fruitful and constructive dialogue with all stakeholders around the country. So
Thank you, Karim. I'm going to push you now to go to the opportunities and policy actions.
I've been asked 3 questions. This is going to be very short. You told me 3 opportunities and policy options, so I'll be very short. I could keep going on for hours on think tanks, but maybe at another time we can organize something. I think like acupuncture, the solution for agriculture are not necessarily in agriculture. You know, when you have a headache, the acupuncturist puts you a needle not on your head, but somewhere in your body. And I think infrastructure for Africa is a key dimension. It happens that I am a small farmer, so I'm in a country in Morocco very well equipped with infrastructure, so we can bring stuff to the market very quickly. But in many countries in Africa, infrastructure is a fundamental is a fundamental dimension, and they should be prioritized maybe to serve agriculture as well, and they need to be green and smart. We cannot do carbon intensive infrastructure like they've been done in advanced economies. Otherwise, in a way, we're all sort of dead. So, and linking farmers to global value chain is fundamental as well. And how you can reach out to international market. We tend to simplify that. It's very complex to be able to reach out to international market. Often the problem is not the production, but is beyond the farm, all the way to the domestic market, to the international market. So there should be a contribution. The public policies should look at that and try to solve this in a very, very sort of down-to-earth and efficient manner at the local level. And of course, productivity and technology. I don't understand why technology is not sort of flowing massively from where it is engineered, mostly in advanced economies, to Africa. It is an interest for the world that Africa feeds itself in a sort of sustainable way. So there may be missing links in the market, missing institution, and the Mmo Panel has been advocating and proposing solutions on irrigation, on technology, etc. So that would be my three sort of opportunities, policy option: productivity, infrastructure, and linking farmers to modern value chains.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Karim, and thank you for bringing the big, very interesting image of acupuncture, and that solutions lie outside of the agricultural sector also. Colleagues, I know we are running out of time. We have about 10 minutes, but there are three people I would like to call on from the audience. I'd mentioned them earlier, and I'll ask them to be very brief so that we can also hear back from our panelists. First one is Racine Lai with academia, and then after that will be Assem Abu Hattab. And then I would like to put Buchaib Bulanur of the African Development Bank on the spot in a moment, if he also wants to make a very brief remark on infrastructure. But first, Racine Lai, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Raju. I just would like to talk quickly, I'll be very brief, on the use of technology innovation to transform food systems. Actually, we should see technology as something that will bring efficiencies within decision-making in the food system. And I know that Fadi mentioned the use of remote sensing. I think that is a huge opportunity that African countries should seize to make better informed policies. I mean, there is a serious potential opportunity in that. The process of making effective decisions requires the availability of those accurate data on the ground. Currently, it's almost impossible to have access to those data on features on Earth. And if we want to go the traditional way, it will require a lot of people on the ground. And still, the accuracy won't be enough for the type of analysis that the food system need, given the shocks that we are very prone to in Africa. And if we combine the remote sensing and the machine learning technology right now, we can not only assess what is currently being, what is affecting the food system on the ground, from the production side mainly, but we will also be able to, let's say, forecast and see the most likely scenarios in the near future. And that can help actually not only to withstand and be more resilient to shocks, but to also, let's say, be more prepared for the next crisis.
Thank you,
but the problem that just quickly, Raju, it's my last point. The main issue in Africa is that we don't have those institutional and technical background in a sustainable way to use those technology. And that's what we're trying to do at academia. And there is a platform that we'll be launching at the end of the month called AGWA, Africa Agriculture Watch. Thank you, over.
Thank you. Please provide information on what you're launching in the chat box. I see a very interesting set of dialogues there also. And I think people will people want to know more about it. I would like to now call upon Assem Abu Hattab, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Economics at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, for brief remarks. Over to you, Assem.
Thank you so much. Let me first thank the panelists for their interesting insights. I think the discussion has covered a wide range of dimensions and aspects related to food systems, but I would like to make a brief comment on the role of middlemen and other intermediaries in the context of food system transformation. So I believe that the intermediaries and middlemen in agri-food value chains in Africa have been neglected by researchers and policymakers in the context of food systems transformation. In most of cases, they have been viewed as opportunist parasites who take advantage of producers' unawareness of market price and their weak bargaining power. However, I believe that they played very important roles in agri-food value chains in transferring products from farmer gates to consumers, increasing added value of agri-food commodities, providing market access, and doing other tasks which could have been more costly and if farmers do it themselves. So this negative perception seems to be reflected in agricultural policies and academic publications in relation to food systems transformation in Africa, which widely ignore the rules of traders, middlemen, and this creates what we call the missing middle in endeavors related to food systems and food security in developing countries. So I suggest, and I think that achieving sustainable food systems in Africa seem to be unreachable task without including and focusing on the middlemen in these transformation processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Assem. Thank you for putting that also on the table. Let me go now to Buchaib Bulanoor of the African Development Bank. I'm putting Buchaib on the spot. If you'd like to make a comment at this time, particularly reflecting on infrastructure, this is the moment to come in. And if not, then forgive me. Would you like to come in at this moment? Okay, I am not hearing or seeing, so let me move on and further. We have about 5 minutes or so. I'd like to give the panelists a chance to give their takeaway messages, but before that, I'd like to ask them the question. And this is partly a follow-on to Lawrence, but also to the question we had in the earlier round, and it has come up several times. And this is the question about we can come up with policy options, but what about actually the capacity to implement transformative policies? So let me ask our panelists to briefly reflect as they also give their closing remarks on how do we strengthen the capacity for policy making and policy implementation in Africa. And so I will combine this so that we can end at 11 in about 5 minutes. I will combine this asking brief reflections on how do we strengthen implementation and enforcement, and your final takeover message. And I'll go in the order in which I'd started, which is Fadi, followed by John, Simba, and Karim having the final word. We wrap up in 5 minutes. Over to you, Fadi.
Thank you very much, Rajul. So to briefly answer this question, what we need to do is to set up policies that are based on conditional incentives to motivate the target groups of these policies to implement the intervention or to regulate the market in the way that the government is trying to achieve its objectives. So policies to increase the impact of the policy, we can depend on the tool of conditional incentives targeted for the target groups, whether it is farmers in the upstream or in the downstream of the supply chains, so they can to motivate them to implement and to achieve the policy objectives. Many other tools, like for example using labeling techniques, sustainable labeling techniques as well, can support achieving policy objectives of the government, as well as a private solution for the supply chain actors that is being generated from the bottom up instead of the top bottom approach. Thank you very much.
Super, Fadi, very interesting. Thank you. John, over to you.
Thank you, Rahul. So to strengthen implementation and enforcement of policies, I would advocate that the stakeholders should really be engaged at a very early stage in the formulation of these policies, just to get their buy-in and also for them to have some form of ownership, which makes it easy when it comes to implementation and enforcement. On the other issue that I'd like to stress as my closing message is that I think some of these issues have been mentioned already, but there's really a need to improve logistics, improve access to supermarkets. I did talk about certification models. This is very important for smallholder farmers to get access to the supermarket and also to external markets. And then lastly, we need to invest in R&D to solve practical problems in food systems. Thank you, and over to you, Raju.
John, thank you so much. Very detailed, very focused remarks, very helpful. Simba, over to you.
Thank you, Raju. Let me start with the capacity to implement. From my experience, this is the capacity issues, very low investment by most member states. And this is reflected in the fact that we have a lot of policies which on paper look very good, but implementation has been very poor. And if you look at, as an example, the CADA process, after 10 years of implementation in 2013, the assessment actually showed that it wasn't so much the technical issues which were the problem, it was mostly institutional issues, and that talks to capacity. So definitely we need to see that governments invest more in the capacity of both state and non-state actors to be able to make sure that those policies deliver. The other point I want to raise is the value of market pull. Yeah, we can use the market to pull the system to transform it. And that brings in the question of market infrastructure, market linkages, especially if you want to transform both at the local level, but also national and regional. So that's important. And lastly, the issue of think tanks, I think is critical, but this is driven by availability of data. Data is critical. Good example is the Malabo commitments and performance on the biennial review process, which African countries committed to at the Malabo Declaration in 2014. And what we have seen is that the performance of countries, in most cases, countries perform low, not so much because they're not doing anything, but because they are not able to capture data on what they are doing. So without knowing what's going on, it's very difficult to talk of transformation. So we want to see countries investing more in collecting data on the appropriate variables so that those think tanks have information on which to provide foresight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simba. Key point of data. How will we know we have transformed if we don't know where we are and where we are going? I'd like to give Karim the final word. Karim, over to you. Have we lost Karim? Karim, you're muted.
No, I'm here.
Great. Now we can hear you. Yes.
Yes. Can you repeat, please? Because I lost you for a couple of...
Yeah, we would like to hear your final takeaway message. And as you do that, could you briefly reflect on capacity for policy implementation? There's no shortage of capacity for coming up with policies, but there's a shortage of capacity for implementation. Your thoughts on how we may improve that and your final takeaway message for the audience.
Oh, you like complex questions.
and in 2 minutes maximum.
Yeah,
1 to 2 minutes, yeah.
What I can tell you is that the truth is in nuances and success is in details. You have to worry about both. There is no strategy with execution. So they're not separated. They're different kind of people usually, but this should be imbricated. This should be taught through very carefully. And this is, you need to nurture that and it is possible to fabricate this capacity. It's about building institution. It's about people and letting people do that. So there are no lessons, but we know how not to do it. I could tell you, share with you our experience. But we know that would be my key lessons. And I think in agriculture, It was mentioned also the supply chain by another speaker. I think it's again about details. I'm not sure centralized functions and administration are able to solve these issues. They need to be very much decentralized. We should involve the youth more, and permanent dialogue and improvement and experimentation and design thinking and policy labs and things like that are the solution. There's nothing true forever. There's just details, execution, strategy, and a permanent sort of the conditions for this to allow for this. No one has the solution. You can't just provide this, the condition for it to happen. And my advice to decision maker would be to make sure they provide this condition and to ask themselves this question permanently.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Karim. That's a great way to bring this roundtable to a close. Colleagues, we've heard from 4 very interesting experts in this field from think tanks and universities. I would like to ask you to join me in please thanking Fadi, in thanking John, Simba, and Karim. This was a great second roundtable that we had. So thank you very much. I would like to now call upon Dr. Ousmane Badiane to introduce our chief guest of honor. So Ousmane, over to you, but a big thank you to our panelists and to the audience, which has raised some very interesting comments in the chat box. Thank you, everyone. Over to you, Ousmane.
Thank you, Rajul, for the great moderation. This was really excellent. And thank you to everybody who's joined us here. So thank you to our think tanks, colleagues, and universities who were in the coordination group. We can be proud of what we got here today. So thank you to all of you, much appreciated. Just one statement regarding the capacity of think tanks, that question that came at the end. There are areas where we are underachieving in a sense that we are not really exploiting sufficiently the resources that we have in our countries. And the contribution of academia, in terms of academics, the contribution of academic think tanks, universities to policy making is much less than what we have capacities to do. We have a kind of a disconnect currently between the policy systems and the academic and research systems. We need to build the bridge and bring them together much more closely. That will allow us to achieve much more with what we have. And of course, we'll still continue to need to build on that system and expand it. But better connection, better alignment, bridge building will already allow us to go quite far. We're trying to do a lot of that as Academia 2063, and we look forward to working with our colleagues around the table here to continue to do that. With that said, let me now invite our guest of honor, Professor Joachim von Braun, co-chair of the Malabo Montpellier Panel, but also a director of the Center for Economic Development Research at the University of Bonn, but prominently for this meeting, more importantly, the chair of the science group that is advising the Food Systems Summit, upon invitation of which we have organized this workshop today. So Joachim, thank you for taking time from your very, very busy schedule to join us. Please, the floor is yours to just give us a couple of statements for the audience here before you move towards closing. Thank you, Joachim, and welcome.
Thank you, Ousmane. Thank you for the invitation, and I enjoyed listening to the panel in the last 45 minutes. And there were great ideas and great comments on how to move forward and impact on the Food Systems Summit. I applaud Academia 2063 and the Malabo Montpellier Panel for launching these dialogues of African think tanks and universities. It will help set the agenda of the summit. The summit, as I'm sure you all know, seeks to transform food systems to be healthier, more sustainable, and more equitable. But were there not food summits before? Yes, there were summits in 1974, 1996, with a follow-up after 5 years, and in 2009. We must ask and analyze what did they achieve and why did they not achieve more? Actually, I believe all of these summits have moved the agenda forward. We should, however, also ask why were objectives not pursued with more rigor and commitments not kept? How can this 2021 summit called for by the UN Secretary General make a more lasting and stronger difference? Specifically to your conference, how can Africa get effectively involved this time in view of the changed global policy and food systems landscape and get a boost out of the summit for its own food system? And what could be Africa's own commitments based on African goals? Actually, Africa follows up on its own agenda, the Agenda 26 and CARDEP, quite effectively. We need such mechanisms following the Food Systems Summit and need to set up the institutional frameworks for that. I believe we can be quite enthusiastic about the Food Systems Summit because of three things are different this time. The summit focuses on the whole food system, number one. It shall involve heads of state, number two. So beyond ministers. And because of a deep involvement of science. It was a bold decision by the UN leadership to appoint a scientific group for the summit, which I have the honor to chair, and there are a number of members, including Usman Badiane, in this workshop, who are also part of the scientific group. Colleagues, the summit needs to address food systems failures that have contributed to the hunger, malnutrition, obesity problems, to the environmental and climate problems, to the problem of poor livelihoods in farming communities. But the Food Systems Summit shouldn't lament about failures, it needs to offer solutions. And that's what the action tracks really engage in, to address these failures. And that's where science-based innovations come in. Innovations in policy for lowering the cost of healthy diets in Africa are urgently needed. Innovations in institutions that strengthen rule-based trade, food safety, health and nutrition, and a productive science and policy interface with strong African voices. Innovations in technologies for higher and more stable yields and productive livestock systems and food processing in Africa. As Karim pointed out on the panel, the policy framework needs to be right, well advised by think tanks, and experimentation should be dared. Senior policymakers hesitate to advocate experimentation because experiments can go wrong and senior policymakers don't like to go wrong. But I think that's a very important point which you, Karim, made. Strategically, food systems need to be embedded in sustainable circular bioeconomies and adhere to a One Health concept, health of people, health of livestock, health of the environment. COVID-19 has brought to the forefront the intertwining of food and health systems. And for that, we need practical propositions, such as John Asafu has made on working with markets and institutions. Linking to you in the African think tank and university community is important for us in the scientific group, and I hope that we can have more interaction with you in the future. Critical is, I want to underline what Simba Sibanda said, capacity building. But capacity building in order to get implementation strengthened. I call on you in the African think tank and university communities to accompany actions by implementation research. So not just the calling for implementation, moving beyond words and agendas and so on, but engaging in implementation research and providing feedback to policymakers. Colleagues, the Food Systems Summit is the opportunity to address food systems problems which only political leaders can tackle in cooperation among nations, well informed by science, the big issues which are confronting us, including the peace and vulnerability issues of nations, the COVID-19 crisis, but also the need to get the world trading and investment agenda well in place. The summit needs to facilitate a change of mindsets based on evidence-based and worldviews. From what I could follow in the last hour in your deliberations, this was a very successful meeting. The scientific group will be happy to cooperate in communicating your findings into the summit process. So I look forward to the documents. Thank you again, Usman and Rajul, for introducing me to this wonderful meeting.
Thank you very much, Joachim. So over to you, Rajul, or is it Katrin?
No, it is me. Thank you so much, Usman. And Joachim, thank you so much for your bold and encouraging words on the role of science and innovation to transform food systems and to how to change mindsets and really to gain strength in how we can effectively use the work of the think tanks to really bring change about. Thank you for that. So colleagues, it is my great pleasure at this time to call on our Chief Rapporteur, and this is Dr. Debisi Araba, member of the Malabo Montpellier Panel, to share with us the summary and key messages from the roundtables, as well as his own insights and reflections. Debisi, I'd like to turn over to you. We are very eager to hear your remarks. Over to you, Debisi.
Okay, thank you very much, Rajul. Hello, everyone. It's been, as I put in the chat, it's been a really engaging discussion. My sincere thanks to the organizers, Rajul, of course, for excellent moderation, and everyone who's made contributions. I really like the side conversations going on in the chats. It got ideas firing in my brain. We had two roundtable discussions. From a world-class roster of speakers. In the first roundtable, we talked about the broader issues around food systems, the drivers for food systems transformation. Our speakers and contributors mentioned issues around urbanization, population and income growth, how that's influencing a change in demand, how that's creating incentives for governments, linkages of rural areas with urban opportunities, understanding why these rural-urban linkages are critical. We also had discussions on the need for policies and mechanisms to mitigate risk against increased environmental degradation. Of course, understanding that we will have about 10 billion people by 2050, and our food systems need to ensure that we are delivering healthy, safe, nutritious food in a way that is equitable, creating affordable livelihoods for everyone participating in agri-food value chains, but also ensuring that we're reducing or minimizing the environmental footprint and impact of these food systems. Of course, we talked about the water, energy, food nexus as well. We had discussions around how we need to bring technology into agriculture to make it more appealing to youth. Professor Mamadou Ka, or Ambassador Mamadou Ka, talked about the rethinking and rebuilding of the Tibet institutions across the continent, how we need to pay attention to technical skills, technical institutions. We had discussions also on the risks to food systems transformation. We talked about the shocks, conflicts, of course. We have the global pandemic that's affecting everything around the world right now. Just to wrap up the first roundtable, we then landed on the need for innovation in institutional arrangements. That food systems, of course, need to go beyond agriculture. We need more coordination. Professor Cheryl Hendricks talked about the transition or the increased role that more national level coordination. We're seeing more national level coordination in food systems transformations, where they're hosted in offices of presidents, prime ministers, or ministers of economic planning. So we're starting to see this move beyond core agriculture and into the core sort of more global economy beyond the core agriculture sector. During the second roundtable, which we just concluded, we looked broadly at the role of think tanks and research institutions in shaping the narrative. I really was again, how do I follow up Professor Joachim von Braun's concluding remarks? But I will suffice it to say that we discussed the need for increased agriculture research and development. Of course, we need to engage youth in agriculture. We need to extend the policy options beyond the agriculture sector. We need new technologies. We need to be more entrepreneurial, not just in connecting research institutions to influence and inform policy decisions. But I would add that we also need to connect research institutions to the private sector. So we need to see more collaboration between research institutions in the agri-food sector and entrepreneurship R&D departments. So whether it's small scale, medium, or large scale, we need to see more collaboration. We certainly need to see more entrepreneurship and experimentation in public policy. So I'll be remiss not to talk about the Malabo Montpellier Panel and the reports that we have produced on nutrition, mechanization, digitalization, irrigation, energy, livestock, and trade, which identify opportunities for governments across the continent to identify case studies where other countries have experimented and are beginning to see measures of success. I think this is important, that governments need that space to experiment and improve the public policy space. I think my last contribution is that we and I sort of put a little bit of this in the chat, is we need to allow ourselves not to be held back by myths that hold us, that sort of stymie the march towards innovation, whether it's in research or public policy. The Michigan State University earlier this year published a report on the Nigerian government's immediate reaction or at the onset of the pandemic. And they articulated and identified 5 myths that held back positive action from the government. The first was the myth around wholesale and retail markets and logistic services not being critical to food security. And another was SMEs and food supply chains stuck in the stagnant, underdeveloped middle. These are not true. We also have, the myth that small farmers are still traditional and poorly integrated with markets. Rural areas dominate food economy, and rural households don't purchase, or they purchase little food, meaning that in rural areas, people grow all that they eat. Of course, we heard earlier today that there is a transformation in the food systems and market systems, and the retail systems are extending outside of urban areas into peri-urban areas and even into rural areas. And the number one myth from this study was that imports are central to national food security. And we think these myths hold back a lot of thinking in innovation. And so even I would say my call to everyone here, because every single person participating, both as a listener and a speaker on this in this session, is able to influence the transformation of food systems in Africa. First of all, I think it's to have a bit of introspection and ask yourself, what is holding us back from changing our minds on certain things? If we assume we have these global or these continental level policy platforms, we have the Agenda 2063, we have the Malabo Declaration, of course, we have the CAADP framework. Is there any aspect of that we think tanks can step away from the dance floor of where all the activities are happening, move to the balcony, and objectively assess what is helping us, or what will help the continent move towards success, and what ideas we need to jettison? What bad ideas are holding us back that we need to let go of? Another example is, what's the future of African food production? Is it going to be millions of smallholder farmers proliferating the continent? Or are we going to have, more mechanization, increased productivity, meaning fewer people at the production hub of the food system and more people in the distribution and consumption hubs? That's again a question for everyone listening. And it's critical because the investments and policies that will go into your understanding of these ideologies will significantly influence what's going to happen in the next 10, 20, 50 years. So I think my main charge, Raju, would be for people to have a righteous heart, but be a bit more introspective, and be open to change your mind once you have the hard science. I think it's important that we allow the research community and think tanks to tackle the hard questions, but also be confident enough to say, whatever the results that come back to us, we should be open to changing our minds if that leads us on the pathway to success. Thank you very much.
Debisi, thank you very much. Wonderful, incredible summary in such a short amount of time, but more importantly, very insightful and inspiring remarks and insights from your side. Thank you very much for that. Colleagues, before I hand over for the next steps, I would just like to thank all of you for the opportunity to moderate the 2 roundtables. I learned so much from you. I was so encouraged and inspired, and as Debisi said, my mind also began to change, or change is not the right word, to spark with new ideas. Really, what an amazing discussion also in the chat boxes that we were getting. So big thank you to all of you. Now, let me hand over to Katrien Glatzel, who's the Director for Policy Innovation at Academia 2063, to share the next steps. Thank you. Over to you, Katrien.
Thank you very much, Raju. So in the interest of time, I will be keeping my remarks really short. So first of all, thank you very much, Debisi, for providing a wonderful summary at the end. I think you did a very great job in summarizing such a rich and intensive discussion over the last 3 hours. So thank you very much. And of course, thank you to all the speakers and members of the coordinating group, and to your participants as well. It's been a very interesting and rich afternoon for us all. And I will be coming to the next step in a moment. Before that, thank you to the entire team at Academia 2063 for all the work that has gone into making this workshop happen today. Thank you. And finally, Raju, wonderful moderation, very effective moderation. It's been a great afternoon. So in terms of next steps, as Usman mentioned at the very beginning, the discussions of today's workshop will be feeding directly into a briefing paper that Academia 2063 is producing in collaboration with members of the coordinating group, so a group of African think tanks and universities, which will be submitted to the scientific group by April and will be available as well then for you to look at and to read. Many of you will have already completed the input form ahead of today's workshop, and we decided to leave the survey a little bit longer open for another week or so. So we would like to encourage all of you who haven't yet completed the survey to please do so, because the information we're collecting there will also be considered as we are drafting the policy paper. My colleagues, I believe, will be sharing the link in the chat, and otherwise you can also access it through our website, which is mmopanel.org. And finally, if you would like to follow the work of Academia 2063 and the Mmo Panel, you can subscribe to our newsletters, where you can stay up to date on all the activities that we're doing in the lead up to the UN Food Systems Summit later this year. With that, I thank you very much again and close this meeting, and wish you all a wonderful rest of the afternoon and evening. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoyed it. It's great. You have a great day and a good rest of the week. Thank you, Joachim.
Thank you, Usman. It was a great session.
Thank you, Usman.
Thank you,
Congratulations. Thank you, Usman. Congratulations.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
For being with us. Ciao.
Mm-hmm.